Paranormal. That cannot be explained by scientific methods.
Told of a creature that was 6.5 to 7 feet tall.
The CIA ran secret mind control experiments.
It's a tale of a creature that's been seen by many, but believed by few.
And experts say there have been reported sightings of paranormal activity.
And there was this creature, and it ran down this hill.
They say something was flying over their house, and they have no idea what it was.
How the world's most powerful individuals are actually shape-shifting reptilians.
My scariest ghost hunting experience.
Jason and JV.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. Who win it now?
Beyond reality. Radio.
It's Tuesday on the West, Wednesday on the East. Many of you are stuck somewhere in between. Welcome to Beyond Reality Radio with myself, Jason Hawes, and the always awesome JV Johnson.
So forgive me if I'm a little lethargic tonight. I just before we came on the show, I was treated to a couple slices of delicious pepperoni pizza.
Okay.
And it wasn't something I expected, but it was something that showed up at my porch. One of our listeners actually had a pizza delivered to my house.
Wow. All right, that's neat.
Well, it's kind of cool because last night in the chat I had said, "Boy, I really want to have a pizza," and one of our good listeners, Daisy, took that to heart, and a pizza showed up on my front door. I was really shocked. So I'm going to try this. Okay, let's just see how this works.
I really wanted a Ferrari.
I was just going to try this.
Oh, what's that? Go ahead.
I really want $1 million. Okay, so let's see what happens. If one of you get on that, it'd be really awesome. Thank you very much.
Well, don't you really only want 500,000, and you want to give 500,000 to your buddy?
I always share with you, my buddy. I always do, so you know that.
Hey, welcome to Beyond Reality Radio, everybody, and it's Jason and JV, and we got a great show tonight.
We do. This is going to be very, very exciting. We kind of took a last-minute detour. We have had Peter Lavinda scheduled to come onto the program for a while now. And the original topic of conversation, which will still be part of tonight's discussion, was his new novel called Dunwich, which is the second volume in a trilogy that began with the Lovecraft Code. And these are books that are inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's work. But then I got it in the as I was doing some research, I saw that Peter also wrote a book called Ratline. And Ratline is a book that outlines how Hitler may have actually escaped Nazi Germany at the end of World War II.
Oh, look at that. And you and I have talked about that many, many times.
This is a topic that you and I have a great interest in. And
I'm a firm believer. I'm a firm believer that he did.
Well, there's a lot of really compelling evidence, but the interesting thing about Peter's book is that he takes a bit of a departure. Most of what you've seen and heard, particularly in things like History Channel's The Hunting Hitler, is that he meaning Adolf Hitler, went to South America.
Yeah. And there's a lot of evidence to support that, right down to even government documents that talk about him being there.
Yes, and the difference here is that Peter has a different theory. Peter has evidence that supports that he went somewhere else. And I'm not going to say where, and I'm not going to say what the evidence is yet. We'll let Peter tell the story, but it's very, very compelling.
No, it sounds like it's going to be interesting.
Should be good.
So, hey, if you haven't yet, head over to Facebook.com/Beyond Reality Radio. Like the Facebook page for us. Then head to BeyondRealityRadio.com, where you can find all the stations we air on across the country. The list is constantly being updated and added to, so check it often. You can also download the free smartphone apps, which allows you to listen live, catch past shows, join the online chat, and more, all on the go. Or any night we're live, just listen right from the website by clicking the Listen Live tab in the upper right-hand corner of the website. And connects you to an online chat room. You can hang out with a great community of people while listening to the show.
A great community of people, and one of them sent me pizza, which is really awesome. Tomorrow night, we've got double guests for you. We've got a guest in each hour. The first hour, we've got David Race joining us. He's a comedian and a paranormal show host. Now, that's an interesting combination. He has a podcast called Comedians Talking About Bigfoot. He also has another podcast called The Monstrosity Podcast, where comedians and celebrities are brought together to discuss paranormal subjects with experts like UFOs, Bigfoots, and Bigfoots. Listen to me, Bigfootses.
How could I not know about this podcast?
I know,
it sounds
right?
Epic.
It does. It sounds awesome. So I can't wait to talk to David in the first hour tomorrow night.
And then the second hour, we'll be talking with John Kuykendall, author and paranormal encrypted investigator. And we'll be discussing his new book, Squatch Files, which made a #1 new release on Amazon. And we'll be getting into his background and his history and so much more.
Yeah, we've got a great week of shows because it ends up on Thursday night with Steve Asher. He's an author and a researcher. He's got a couple of books out that we'll talk about, including Hauntings of the Kentucky State Penitentiary and Hauntings of the Western Lunatic Asylum.
That sounds perfect.
Good stuff.
The best show out there.
Good stuff, for sure.
All right, so what'd you end up doing over the weekend? Anything?
Of course, I was at Pennhurst Paracon.
Yeah, how'd that go?
That was great. It was brutally hot on Saturday. And this particular event, they actually do outside in the courtyard of Pennhurst Asylum, which is a nice, beautiful surroundings. But it was so hot and so humid near Philadelphia that it was quite uncomfortable. But there were still a lot of people. I got to say hello to a lot of friends and fans, and it was a really great time. I had an awesome time there. So it was a good weekend. Weekend well spent.
We got totally rained out here. I took the kids to Washington County Fair, and there was like a 10% chance of rain, but that turned into pretty much 100% because it rained for 2.5 hours nonstop.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, huge amounts.
Well, there's been, I hate saying this stuff given the fact the West Coast is under such horrible conditions with the fires and the droughts.
They need the rain.
Wow. And we just keep getting dumped on in the East, in the Northeast here. It seems to be known. There's moss on everything right now outside. Everything is covered in moss.
Hey, a little thing you might not realize. Since we'll be talking about some of the stuff with Lovecraft tonight, yesterday was his 128th birthday.
Wow.
So and he was from Providence, Rhode Island. So
yeah,
it's
and
definitely a big touch right here.
He's a very, very interesting character. He's one of these guys that his work was never even considered acceptable while he was alive.
Yeah.
And somehow after the fact, and I don't really know the story, but somehow after the fact, someone found his work and started to rediscover it and reintroduced it to people, and it became a bit of a cult sensation. And there's been movies made based on his work, and obviously a lot of books, and obviously things like Peter Lavinda's trilogy, which is based on Lovecraft's work.
And he was an extremely strange individual, and also dealt with serious anxiety disorders and everything. He died, I think it was 46 years old. I think it was.
Yeah, it was
when he passed away.
He was young. It's very strikingly similar to Edgar Allan Poe's life, and Poe wasn't appreciated during his time either. Died young, so some haunting similarities there.
Yeah, and hey, just in case this radio thing doesn't work out for you, I just wanted to let you know that Janet Airlines is still hiring. I don't know if you were aware of that.
No,
They're looking for a pilot. You know Janet Airlines, right?
Are we talking about the one that flies to Area 51?
That is correct.
Okay.
All right. So pilots are wanted for the secretive Janet Airlines to fly to Area 51. If you're into UFOs, I mean, this is a great job opportunity if you think about it. But Janet Airlines, the unofficial name of the classified fleet for the United States Air Force, is looking for pilots to join their secretive ranks at McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas. The planes, which don't carry any company logos and are painted white with horizontal red bands along the side, transport military and contract employees to these restricted sites, including the infamous Area 51 and the Tonopah Test Range in Nevada. So they're referred to as Janet because that's the call signs when they're flying over civilian airspace. It's believed to stand for just another non-existent terminal. Founded in 1972. So, and they say that the fleet consists of 6 Boeing 737 and 600s, as well as 5 smaller executive turboprops.
All right. Well, I'll have to ask you this. I mean, do they have openings for flight attendants? Because I can't fly a plane, so I can't really apply for that particular job.
I just couldn't see you serving me or others drinks and stuff.
Yeah, I can't see it
making one for me, half one for you, two for me, one for you.
I was a waiter once for a summer, and I spilled more drinks on people than I care to admit to. So I'm not very good at doing that.
Oh, geez. Well, on that note, we're going to take a quick break. A lot more to come. You listen to Jason and JV Beyond Reality Radio. We'll be back after this.
Stay tuned for more Beyond Reality Radio.
Don't be jealous that I've been chatting online with babes all day.
I just want to say that you guys do a great job. It's very interesting listening to you guys.
And I have to say quickly that you guys run a wonderful show. You guys do a great job. You guys do a really tight show.
I listen to you guys constantly. It's a fantastic show.
Guys, I totally missed you. This whole place missed you. I mean, we were lost without.
If you could see what I could see, that's all I'm saying. Only on Beyond Reality Radio with Jason Hawes and JV Johnson.
And welcome back to the show. It is Beyond Reality Radio with Jason and JV. Write down the phone number to join our conversation later. It's 844-687-7669. Our guest tonight, we've had on the program before. Peter Lavinda is an author and a historian. You should stop by his website, which is just his name, peterlavenda.com. And he's got a new book out. It's actually the second in a trilogy. It's the second volume. It's called Dunwich. It follows the Lovecraft Code, which we had Peter on talking about the last time he was on the program. Peter, welcome back to Beyond Reality Radio. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Oh, thanks for coming on, Peter.
So this, the book Dunwich is the second in your trilogy that kind of draws some inspiration from H.P. Lovecraft's work. The first book was the Lovecraft Code. Introduce us to what the trilogy is about, so before we can start talking about the second book, which is Dunwich.
Sure. It's the story of Professor Gregory Angel, who's a professor of religion and religious studies at Columbia University. He's a descendant of George Angel, who is introduced in The Call of Cthulhu by Lovecraft. George Angel has a document concerning the Cthulhu cult. He's asked to sort of give his opinions about it in that story. And then a lot of weird things happen. There's a student from Rhode Island School of Design who is involved in making a sculpture that he sees in his dreams, and it's the same image of Cthulhu that the professor sees in other places. So he knows something strange is going on. Eventually, though, George Angel is murdered on the docks in Providence, and his document goes missing and all of that. So my story sort of picks up, years later. One of his descendants is Gregory Angel, and he's from the Angel family. The Angel family was actually a very well-known, very prominent family in Providence in real life. Lovecraft was basing his story on people and a family that actually existed there and had a tremendous influence on Brown University and the academic life in Providence and in Massachusetts. There was a lot of crossover between the Angels and the Whalens and other people that sort of creep into Lovecraft's stories. So my guy is Gregory Angel, and he was a religious studies professor whose one of his relatives died on 9/11. And actually, this is also true. David Angel, a famous television producer from shows like Frasier, for instance, and Wings, and of course Cheers, those three shows. He was a producer on it, a writer on it. He died on 9/11. The plane that he was on from Boston crashed into the North Tower. So I use that as the basis for this guy, this invented character, Gregory Angel, who's related to all of the angels and who feels motivated now to do something. And he speaks the languages of the Middle East. So he's brought by an intelligence agency to help them go into the Middle East and find a book that everybody seems to be talking about, and which seems to be so crucial to maybe an uprising involving Al-Qaeda and other kinds of terrorist groups. So he's brought out, he goes for a few missions ahead of time, just helping after 9/11, embedded with the troops, but he sees something in Mosul in northern Iraq which totally blows him away. He sees a massacre of people called the Yazidi. And when that happens, he kind of loses his faith in God and religion and everything else and doesn't want to be bothered. He doesn't even know who he is anymore. And that's when he's tapped by this mysterious intelligence group operating out of the National Security Agency in Fort Meade, a shadowy organization that sends him out back again reluctantly, really against his will, to go out into Iraq and to find this book that everybody seems to be talking about. And that's the Lovecraft Code. That's how it all starts. So we follow Gregory Angel through all of these countries, through Central Asia, all the way into Nepal, into the Himalayas, where he has a confrontation with the cult that has seized this book and is using it to summon dark powers. And we leave him at the end of the Lovecraft Code. I won't go into, no spoiler alerts here, but eventually he does get his hands on this book, and he sort of disappears. And now everybody's looking for him. And the book Dunwich picks up from that point. And it starts off with alien abduction. In the very first opening scenes, there's an alien abduction scenario, and talk about genetics and genetic testing and who's the father of this woman's children in Providence. And then it goes on from there and becomes really insane after those first few pages.
It becomes really insane? Sounds like we already...
The whole story's
it wasn't
been
really
insane.
Rational to begin with.
Well, the whole as a person, I live in Rhode Island myself, and as a person from Rhode Island, of course, H.P. Lovecraft is a very important figure here. He's buried in Providence and so forth. And but the Dunwich Horror was based on a fictional town in Massachusetts called Dunwich, correct?
Yep, that's correct.
So and then it just go ahead.
And
Sorry.
it goes on from there. I mean, the book Dunwich is based on the Dunwich Horror. So the Dunwich Horror, if you go back and reread it with a sort of a jaundiced eye, you'll see that really the Dunwich Horror is about a lot of very strange things. It's not just a sort of horror story. There's a lot more to it than that. There's really the theme of incest and using children in ritual sacrifice and ritual ceremonial magical rituals is really front and center in the Dunwich Horror. And it's even hinted, Lovecraft goes so far as to hint that this is what this is all about in the story itself. He has all the villagers whispering, how did old man Whately, and his daughter suddenly have a child? I mean, what's that all about? So, and it all happened during a magical ritual. So Dunwich is about those themes. It's about alien abduction. It's about ritual magic. It's, magic involving children, which is a very sensitive topic. And I'm trying to approach it in this era where everybody's talking about things like that, to try to bring some understanding to what it would really be like if this was, actually part of a ritual magic agenda or formula, however you want to put it.
We're talking with Peter Lavinda, author of the book Dunwich, which is the second volume in a trilogy. First book is called The Lovecraft Code. His website is peterlavenda.com, and we're going to continue the conversation right after the break.
Yeah, the phone number for calling in later will be 844-687-7669. Again, toll free at 844-687-7669. You're listening to Jason JV, Beyond Reality Radio. We'll be back after this.
Can I come over after school?
Welcome back to the program, Beyond Reality Radio. It's Jason and JV. We've got a great guest tonight. Peter Lavinda is with us. He's an author and a historian. We're going to be talking about his book, Ratline, a little bit later in the program, which is Peter's investigation and presentation of some very, very compelling evidence that Adolf Hitler did not commit suicide in the bunker in the late days of World War II in Berlin.
It's a topic that you and I have talked about many, many times.
We have. And there's some competing ideas as to where he may have ended up if he did, in fact, escape Germany. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But right now we're talking about Dunwich. Dunwich is Peter's second book, the second volume of a trilogy that began with the Lovecraft Code. And Peter, I want to ask you about Lovecraft himself. We were speaking in the introduction of the program tonight. He wasn't appreciated in his time, and frequently find that there are authors, I think Edgar Allan Poe was another one, didn't really receive the recognition that he may have deserved while he was alive, and it all kind of happened after they left us. With Lovecraft, what was it about his work that was the life cycle of it?
Well, it wasn't really mainstream. I mean, it wasn't the kind of writing that would appeal to a broad section of humanity. It appealed to a certain type of person. It appealed to young men for the most part, those who would today in this day and age, be reading, Marvel comics or something, or back in the 30s and 40s, maybe Weird Tales and things like that. It was sort of in that genre of horror fiction, which appealed to, a smaller segment of the population at the time. Now it's sort of a bigger business, but in those days, I think it was kind of considered almost tabloid or pulp fiction. And it really didn't rise to the level of literature, in the eyes of literary critics and people like that. It was a kind of a specialty. And of course, Lovecraft's prose is rather purple. I mean, it takes a little getting used to. He favors archaic words and archaic combinations and weird spellings of words and things. So it's very idiosyncratic. So you have to kind of get on board with it. But in the last 30 years or so, there's been really a rediscovery of Lovecraft. Even Joyce Carol Oates, wrote an anthology, or published an anthology of Lovecraft's work with her own introduction to it. So it started to take on more of a mainstream, like, look who we've overlooked. Look at there's this gem, this jewel of American literature that, for whatever reason, back in the 20s, we really didn't pay much attention to. And of course, he was being published in very fringe publications as well. So it didn't really reach a wider audience.
No, and for a long time there, it seemed that it was more just for the goth type crowd. And now it's really opened up to pretty much everybody out there.
Yeah, and it's been reinterpreted a lot also. Of course, I'm guilty of that as well. But a lot of movie producers and directors have kind of reinterpreted Lovecraft in more modern times. A lot of the stuff that you see, like Alien versus Predator, for instance, things like that, have a heavy Lovecraftian flavor. Going down into the Antarctic and, finding this vast subterranean temple and these alien beings in there. That's really right out of Lovecraft. So you had that idea that there were these alien beings that were trying to get back into the earth, and then it gets recycled into Eric von Daniken and Chariots of the Gods, and Zecharia Sitchin in his books on, the Sumerians and the Babylonians and, aliens coming down and trying to do something on the earth, manipulate humans or something. That was Lovecraft. I mean, that was his métier. That was his environment, really.
A lot of people will read his work or the work of other authors, and not many then decide to write something that's inspired by those works. What made you write your trilogy as inspired by Lovecraft?
I just found that there was a lot in Lovecraft that bared looking at again. I found a lot of weird synchronicities and coincidences between Lovecraft's work, for example, and some writings by Aleister Crowley. The weird thing about Lovecraft, and I know I've said this before, but it's something that really stands out, is that Lovecraft is very specific about month, day, and year in his stories. I mean, there's something about Lovecraft that he feels compelled to say, on this day, month, and year, this is what happened. So I have like a timeline to work with. So with that timeline, I go back and I realize that at one point, Lovecraft is writing about a weird ritual that takes place on November 1st, 1907, or October 31st to November 1st, 1907, in the bayous, in Louisiana, outside of New Orleans. And that date rang a bell, and I looked over Lovecraft's writings, and sure enough, on that very same month, day, and year, October 31st, 1907, Crowley is actually in the process of writing what he later would call his holy books. And these were sort of almost stream of consciousness prose, with a lot of allusions to black monoliths and black basalt, temples and weird eldritch things. And Lovecraft is actually writing this on that very day in 1907. And then Lovecraft puts the Call of Cthulhu's first major ritual in New Orleans in October 31st, 1907. And I thought, well, that's weird because the writing is so similar. And the idea of these rituals are so similar that it appeared as though one was talking to the other. And we know now that Lovecraft may have had, some fleeting familiarity with the name of Aleister Crowley, but he certainly hadn't read these books. And he would not have known about all the details and, the lacunae of Aleister Crowley's work and when he wrote this and when he did that and, all this other stuff. So that was compelling to me. It looked like there was something going on here, that there was some sort of, avatar, some sort of maybe a kind of strange connection between these two writers, because they're both writing about weird states. They're writing about rituals. They're writing about contact with non-human entities. And all of this, fell together for me. And I thought, wow, there's something going on there. That was one impetus for the books. The other one was the fact that we're now in the midst of a lot of news and a lot of angst about the Middle East. The mad Arabs are really mad Arabs now. They're really mad and they're really Arab. So the mad Arab of Lovecraft's writing now has taken on this form. It's an actuality, and you have this tremendous turmoil out there, and yet people tend to think that it's a monolithic culture, which is far from the truth. They think that, for instance, Islam is the only religion out there which is far from the truth, and that it's monolithic, which is also not true. And I wanted to show some of that. I wanted to show all the different kinds of cults and religions that exist out there next to each other, cheek by jowl, all these really weird little groups that, somehow manage to coexist under those circumstances. So the Lovecraft Code, the first novel, takes you through that. And all the groups that I mentioned are real. They're factual. There's a heavy dose of fact and I would say almost revelation in Lovecraft Code about real groups of people and what they really believed and their relationships with their neighbors, the Yazidi being, foremost among them, but other groups too, like Al-Haq and a lot of others, the Zoroastrians in Iran, and the groups on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Kafiri. So there's a lot of really weird religious groups out there in that part of the world, and people don't realize that. And I wanted to really focus on that and give an idea of the context for what Lovecraft was thinking about when he came up with Abdul al-Hazred and the Mad Arab and all of that.
Your books have been compared favorably, I might add, to the Da Vinci Code. Would you say that folks who like that type of intrigue and that type of mystery are going to find some of that in this trilogy?
They will. They'll actually find it, but not in the Da Vinci Code sense of Christianity and the Holy Grail and all of that. It's really focused more on the non-Christian, almost non-Abrahamic religions. So we're talking about, the weird cults that existed in the Middle East, but also when you get into Dunwich, we're talking about Asian groups as well, and Asian interpretations of Islam or of Buddhism or Hinduism and all of that. And it's all real, as I say. I mean, my books, in this case, this trilogy, is like a roman à clef. It's a novel that has a lot of Easter eggs in it. A lot of references to people, places, and things. Some of them are overt, and others are sort of playfully concealed because I'm talking about maybe living people or actual groups that exist today. But astute readers will pick that up pretty quickly, and they have. I mean, people have been writing reviews and picking up on the allusions. So it's like a Da Vinci Code, but with things actually happening today. People, places, and things are being mentioned that are actual, and I picked that up from Lovecraft. Using months, days, and years. And I'm really drawing a very close parallel to things that actually were taking place on those times, on that timeline represented in the novels.
The third book, I believe, is coming out pretty soon as well, right? I mean, when did Dunwich come out?
It came out earlier this year.
Earlier this year. And then the third book
spring.
is coming out in the fall? Is that right?
No, it'll come out probably in the spring.
It has to be
finished. It has to be finished in the fall.
I was going to say that's pretty ambitious.
Yeah, no, it'll be in the spring of 2019. I believe that's how we're scheduling it now. And it's going to be called Starry Wisdom. And that's going to bring all of this to a head. It's going to bring all the various threads together. And that's going to be based loosely on the Shunned House and Haunter of the Dark. So all of those, the idea of a church that had to be moved out of Providence and then down to New Orleans is the framework for Starry Wisdom, the third novel.
We're going to go to break here in just a minute, and when we come back, I want to change the topic and start talking a little bit about your book, Ratline. But before I do, where can folks get a hold of, right now, the first two books, The Lovecraft Code and Dunwich of the trilogy?
Certainly, you can get them on Amazon. They've been there, and Barnes and Noble, if their websites are still up, you can get it from there as well. All the usual suspects.
Great.
Our guest tonight is Peter Lavinda, an author and historian. We're talking about H.P. Lovecraft, his books, and so much more. And we're going to be back right after this. You listen to Jason and JV, Beyond Reality Radio. We'll be right back.
Can't
Talking Heads, Psycho Killer, one of their most recognizable songs, and maybe a very, very appropriate way to change our topic and to begin our discussion about Adolf Hitler. Of course, the leader of Nazi Germany, a man responsible for some unspeakable horrors. And our guest tonight is Peter Lavinda. He's an author and a historian, and Peter wrote a book called Ratline. Peter, I think that you released that book in 2012. Is that correct?
That sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, and let's start, because Ratline is an examination of what actually happened to Adolf Hitler following, in the last days of World War II. The official story is that he, or was anyway, that he committed suicide with Eva Braun, and his body and her body were thrown into a little pit outside the entrance to the bunker and burned with gasoline, and the Soviets found those charred remains when they captured Berlin. We have about 5 minutes in this segment. Let's take those minutes and kind of recount that official story and where some of the holes in that story started to pop up.
Sure. Well, the official story is that on April 30th, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. Hitler and Eva Braun both committed suicide. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, and his entire family committed suicide. And General Krebs also committed suicide, and their little dog, too. The Goebbels dog was also killed. So all of these people are now dead. They've committed suicide. The problem with the story is that we don't know exactly who was shot and who took cyanide. Between Hitler and Eva Braun, there's conflicting stories, even among the people in the bunker, as to what actually happened to the two of them. But at any rate, according to the story, all of these bodies were taken outside, and the guards at the Führer bunker were told to pour gasoline and cremate the bodies. Well, it's really, really hard to cremate human remains with just a can of petrol, of gasoline. It's that you need a really high flame, you need an enclosed area, you need basically a crematorium in order to do this right. And it's kind of sickeningly ironic that the Nazis, who created some of the most famous crematoria in the world, could not actually incinerate Hitler and his wife. But at any rate, so these bodies are thrown into a pit. The Soviets enter Berlin from that side, and Soviet agents from SMERSH, which is their counterintelligence, military counterintelligence, find the bodies, dig them up, claim they found Hitler and Eva's bodies, as well as the Goebbels family and Krebs and the dog, and they load them all into a van. And this is where the odyssey starts, because according to what we knew at that time, the bodies had been discovered, they had been cremated, and taken away. The problem is that Stalin kept saying he didn't believe Hitler was dead. And if Stalin didn't know when his own people had, taken the bodies, then who would know? And so the rumors started to go all around the world that Hitler had survived. Now, did he shoot himself? Did he take cyanide? Did he do both? How did Eva die? Did he shoot her? Did he give her cyanide? All of these stories. And we have so many conflicting stories from the people in the bunker that we really don't know what happened. And then later, the Soviets had prisoners, German prisoners from the bunker that they had captured, and they're getting all different kinds of stories from them. And the British are getting different stories from their prisoners. And then people like Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, the guy who rescued Mussolini from the top of that mountain using his paratroopers. Skorzeny, when he was captured in Austria, claimed that Hitler must still be alive. He was sure that Hitler had escaped alive. Hanna Reitsch, which was Hitler's favorite pilot, a woman pilot who was just a daredevil with an airplane, flew into Berlin in the last days and tried to convince Hitler to fly out with her. She was going to fly him to someplace safe, and for some reason he said no, but they talked a lot about their last stand that they would make near Salzburg. Hanna Reitsch flew out like the day before April 30th, and then she was captured in Austria by the authorities, and she told the same story. She said Hitler no way committed suicide. He was on his way out. He was going somewhere. So all of these stories started to spread around, and nobody knew what the truth was until just a couple of years ago we begin to discover that there's actually no forensic evidence to show that Hitler died in the bunker.
Well, and I know that they even ran the University of Connecticut, and we'll get into a lot of this, ran tests on the skull, and it came back as a female, 40 or under.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, I know the archaeologist who performed those tests, Nicholas Bellantoni, and I contacted him about this when the story broke. He had actually examined the skull in Moscow, the ones the Russians said they had, a skull with a bullet hole in it. Well, you know, there were a lot of skulls with bullet holes in them. So, I mean, it could have been anybody, right? But they said this has to be Hitler because he shot himself. So it was kind of ridiculous. And he took a piece of that back with him, had it tested, and no, it was not Hitler's skull by any stretch of the imagination. And the Russians themselves published their story of what they did to these bodies, and it's ridiculous. I mean, it's actually ridiculous. I sat there and I read this thing, and I thought, this is your official account? You couldn't lie to us just a little better than this? You know?
Yeah, no, it's true. You're right, because they also, and then they tried to claim that they had more evidence, and we'll get into that, but talking about jawbone fragments and stuff like that, which proved it was Hitler, but a lot more to come. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be really getting into this. You're listening to Jason and JV on Beyond Reality Radio. We'll be back after this.
Paranormal. That cannot be explained by scientific methods.
Told of a creature that was 6.5 to 7 feet tall.
The CIA ran secret mind control experiments.
It's a tale of a creature that's been seen by many, but believed by few.
And experts say there have been reported sightings of paranormal activity.
And there was this creature and it ran down this hill.
They say something was flying over their house and they have no idea what it was.
How the world's most powerful individuals are actually shape-shifting reptilians.
My scariest ghost hunting experience.
Jason and JV.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. Can't handle the truth.
Beyond reality radio.
It's Tuesday on the West Coast, Wednesday on the East. Many of you are stuck somewhere in between. Welcome to Beyond Reality Radio with myself, Jason Hawes, and the always awesome JV Johnson.
I've got some good news and some bad news. By the way, we will bring our guest, Peter Lavinda, back in just a moment here. But news reports have indicated that tests on mosquitoes, on Long Island specifically, have turned up more instances of West Nile virus and other harmful viruses to humans than ever before. These numbers are getting out of control, and they're becoming dangerous. And they're highly recommending that people do as many things as they can to cut down on the mosquito population, including things like, making sure there's no standing water around your home. Some people don't realize if they leave even a garbage can top upside down and it collects some water, it becomes a breeding ground for mosquitoes. You ever look in those things and see those little things swimming around? Those are mosquito larvae.
Mosquito, I'm telling you, they're like some of them and ticks. They're the worst insects in the world.
And ticks are doing the same thing. But here's the good news. Scientists have actually developed a way, and they think it's going to be very, very effective, and they're testing it now in Brazil. They've created in the laboratory sterile male mosquitoes. And
Really?
they're releasing these mosquitoes into the wild using drones. This is the key factor, is that they can send these drones over swampy areas where these mosquitoes breed. They dump out these sterile mosquitoes. They mate with the female mosquitoes, but clearly because they're sterile, nothing happens. But it basically pushes out the sterile males, and the mosquito population gets cut down without the use of any chemicals or any artificial means.
That is nice. I mean, I don't see any positive thing for mosquitoes. And mosquitoes are the leading cause of pretty much deaths throughout the world.
Yeah, they're disease carriers for sure. This technique, they're saying it's not something you just do one time. You've got to do it over and over again. But then again, if you were spraying with pesticides, you'd have to do the same thing. So they're trying this, but they say they have to release about 10 of these sterile male mosquitoes for every one that is actually in the wild for this to be effective. So maybe this is a way that this will help solve some of this problem.
And I don't know about you, but I've noticed mosquitoes, they are more aggressive than ever over the last 10 years. And I know we got this one that's been showing up here. It's some Asian tiger mosquito or whatever, but it's said to be highly aggressive. And no matter how many times you swat at it, it just keeps coming.
Yeah, I just assumed I was just sweeter than I have been in years, and that's why they're coming after me a little bit more. I don't know.
That's a possibility, but
that was my guess.
I hate mosquitoes.
All right, let's bring our guest back into the program. Peter Lavinda is an author and a historian. He's written many books about many different things, including the book we were talking about earlier, Dunwich, which is the second in his trilogy that started with the Lovecraft Code, and the book we're talking about now, Ratline, which is an investigation and a look into what actually happened to Adolf Hitler. Peter, before we went to break, you were telling us what, quote-unquote, the official story was. The Soviets capture Berlin. Some Soviet personnel enter the compound where the entrance to Hitler's bunker is, and you say they find these bodies that were partially cremated, and partially probably isn't even the right way to describe it. Were these bodies pointed out to them by anybody? Did they stumble upon them? And what made them convinced, or at least what made them think that these were the bodies of Hitler and some of his henchmen and their families?
Well, actually, the identification of Hitler and Eva in particular was done through believe it or not, through dentures. Both of the corpses had been fitted with new dentures, brand new sets of dentures, both the male and the female corpse. And even the Soviets pointed out that the dentures did not fit properly into the skulls, but because the dentures matched drawings that were given to them or made for them by a dental technician they had captured in Berlin, who drew them from memory. There were no actual documents about the dentures. He drew these from memory, and it matched more or less the dentures they had for Hitler and Eva, so therefore they assumed that the two bodies they had were Hitler and Eva Braun. The problem was the dental technician told the Russians that he had made two sets of dentures for each person, two sets for Hitler, two sets for Eva, and he did this in April of 1945. Now that doesn't make any sense at all.
None.
When you're planning, when the country is falling apart and you're actually considering suicide, you're going to go and order two sets of identical dentures, both for you and for Eva Braun. Why two sets? So obviously they needed dentures. Hitler had horrible teeth. I think he only had 3 actual teeth in his head by that time, by April of 45. Eva was in better shape, but at any rate, he has these 2 sets of dentures made, and those records evidently existed. So 2 sets of dentures are made right at the last moment, right just before Berlin falls. And one set is found in these 2 bodies. The other set has never been recovered. This leads you to the obvious conclusion that there was like this insurance scam thing being developed, right? You make these fake dentures, stick them into a corpse, and well, that must be Hitler then because those are his dentures. And that seems to have been the plot. But of course, we don't have proof of this because we don't have the bodies. And what happened is the Russians took the bodies, all the bodies, including Goebbels' family, and there's like 7, 8 people there, and this General Krebs and the dog. And they take all these bodies, put them in a van, and they drive them out of Berlin. And now the Odyssey starts. And this is according to the Soviets' own publication on this, which came out a few years ago. They have the bodies in the van. They stop somewhere in the woods, and they bury the bodies. Then they come back a little later, like a day or 2 later. They dig up the bodies, put them back in the van, drive them someplace else, bury them again. This goes on 2 or 3 more times. Finally, they get to the town of Magdeburg, which will be now in East Germany, and there's going to be a KGB headquarters there, a KGB office of some kind, and there's a parking lot. They bury the bodies again for the final time in this parking lot, pave it over, and that's the final resting place until 1970 of Hitler and Eva Braun. So the question remains, if that's the Russians' official story of what they did to the bodies, where did that skull in Moscow come from, right? So in 1970, on orders of Yuri Andropov, who at that point is head of the KGB, the KGB goes to Magdeburg, to that city. They dig up the bodies again. This is in 1970 now. This is, far after 1945. And They take them down to a river and they burn the bodies. Once again, they really cremate the bodies this time and throw the ashes into the river. And then that's the end of the story. According to the official publication by the Russians, this is what happened. Now, the story about Hitler and Hitler's survival and the bodies and all the rest of it and driving them around and all of that was known as Operation Myth in the KGB archives. That's Operation Myth. I mean, right away, like I say, couldn't you lie just a little better? Make us all feel better. But they had to lie outrageously. So they call this thing Operation Myth. But the funny thing is the British, in 1945, as the Russians are driving around with these supposed bodies of Hitler and Eva, the British now have to come up with a story that proves Hitler is actually dead because they don't want people, thinking Hitler is still alive. They don't want Hitler to be, to run some sort of a back, channel kind of operation in Europe or wherever he's going to be. They don't want people looking for him. So basically they have to prove Hitler is dead so everybody can get on with their lives. And so they tell this historian, Hugh Trevor Roper, go out there, you have 3 months. Find us the evidence that Hitler died in the bunker, that Hitler's dead, he's not coming back. You've got 3 months to do this. We know you don't speak German. You won't have access to the prisoners the Soviets have. You probably won't have access to the prisoners the Americans had. You only have access to ours. Talk to them, put together the story. And by the way, the project name or the operation name for this operation is Operation Nursery. So now you've got nursery and myth, I mean, come on, so Trevor Roper goes and he talks to a lot of people, and Trevor Roper himself says eyewitness testimony is the most unreliable there is. And he's getting stories that don't match from everybody. Everybody's telling him a different story. A shot rang out, Hitler shot himself. No, Hitler took cyanide. No, Hitler and Ava both took cyanide. No, Hitler shot Ava. No, Ava shot Hitler. No, somebody came into the room and shot both of them. I mean, everybody had a different story. And all of these prisoners, of course, are mostly SS. So what possible motivation would they have to lie about anything? Right? So now you've got all these stories coming there. You've got all the stories the Soviets are being told by their prisoners, who change their stories every 10 minutes, depending on how they're being tortured. And so all these stories, nothing matches, but, Hugh Trevor Roper, being the MI6 officer that he is, puts it all together and creates a story and says, yes, Hitler died in the bunker. We have the evidence because so-and-so told me so. And that was it. That was supposed to settle everybody's, hash for this. But there was no forensic evidence. Nobody had a shred of evidence that Hitler survived. In fact, they found Hitler doubles. They found two of them. One of them was dead. The Soviets found this guy they thought was Hitler, had a photograph taken with him, and later it turned out to have been one of Hitler's doubles. And they found another double living quietly in another town somewhere. So they know that Hitler had doubles already. So who was in the crypt, in the grave outside of the bunker? No, nobody knows, because we don't have those bodies. We have no evidence any longer.
Well, and a lot of people believe it to be pretty much innocent doubles that were murdered and put there. But there's also, the FBI had documents talking about how they believed that Hitler had escaped and made it to Argentina and so forth. And so we were looking into it. I mean, our government was looking into it even while they were passing this information as if he was dead.
Yeah. Eisenhower didn't believe that Hitler had died. For instance, in the beginning, he was convinced that Hitler had escaped. Everybody was talking about this. And, there's an interesting little bit of information. The OSS during the war, which was the forerunner of the CIA, they had done a psychological profile of Hitler, but they had also developed some kind of propaganda stuff about Hitler and predicting what he would do. And they're predicting, some sort of Götterdämmerung kind of, self-immolation thing at the end of the war. They romanticized this up as well. And so the story was already there. The story had been created even before the end of the war. So they were looking at that kind of a Hitler killing himself and then dying on a funeral pyre. They had already figured this out like a couple of years before the end of the war. It's very mysterious how all that came together. And I would never, ever have believed that Hitler had survived the war had it not been for the events that I became involved with in 2009, 2010, where the whole thing just came together.
All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to open that discussion. We could spend the whole show just talking about the official version of what was said to have happened to Hitler, but we don't have time to do that because we need to get to part B of this story, which we'll do after the break.
Our guest is Peter Lavenda, author and historian, and we're going to take a quick break. A lot more to come. You listen to Jason JV, Beyond Reality Radio. We'll be back after this.
stand here helplessly, hoping you'll get into me. I am so into you, I can't think of nothing else. I am so into you.
Welcome back to the program, Beyond Reality Radio with Jason and JV. Our guest tonight, Peter Lavinda, author and historian. We're now talking about his book, Ratline. I believe, Peter, actually, you followed up Ratline. Was it another book or a revised edition of the book?
No, another book. It's called The Hitler Legacy that came out in 2014. And that takes everything that I learned in Ratline plus a lot of additional information that came to me because of Ratline. People suddenly started contacting me, people who knew more about the story, had additional documents. So they enabled me to really go into the story in much more depth.
So we have about just a little less than 4 minutes in this segment. Tell us what happened that started to turn your head in the direction of what you now believe actually happened to Hitler.
Well, I was in Indonesia, of all places. I was spending 3 months there at a university. I was getting my master's degree in religious studies, and it involved a semester that I was taking in Indonesia. And when I was there, people started telling me this outrageous story, it seemed to me, that Hitler had, escaped after the war and had gone to Indonesia, of all places, to a remote island, way to the east of Java, east of Bali, all the way out there, right around the area where the Komodo dragons come from. And that Hitler had gone there with Eva Braun and had lived there as a doctor and then had died in 1970. And my reaction was, yeah, right, sure, of course. And, of course, I didn't believe a word of it. I mean, it sounded like something totally outrageous. But then at that same time, in 2009, then Nick Bellantoni came out with this story. I mean, he was on television showing that the skull the Russians had was not Hitler's skull. So there wasn't any evidence that Hitler actually died in the bunker. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, I better look at this a bit more closely. And the story in Indonesia came up with documents, with a small booklet was published that had photographs of this guy who supposedly was Hitler, had photographs of documents that were in German that were found with him or that he had owned. And I started looking at all this and I thought, wow, I mean, if this isn't Hitler, this is a Nazi war criminal who, for whatever reason, wound up in Indonesia. And so I started to really dig into that story a lot more. And it gradually occurred to me that maybe I was really looking at something very genuine, that the Indonesians were not far off, that maybe it was or it wasn't Hitler, but it was somebody important who decided they had to hide in the middle of nowhere compared to Austria and Germany and just live out their days in obscurity. So I looked at that information. I got contacted by other people, and an odyssey really began of me living in Asia for longer periods of time, dealing with the guy in Singapore who had actually all that original documentation. I mean, he actually had the physical passports and everything else of these two people who had escaped after the war to Indonesia. And, the guy is the right height, the right age, was born in Austria. I mean, everything started to fit into this pattern. And he had the same mustache. He had the Hitler mustache, the whole 9 yards. And his wife, looked like Eva Braun. So there was a possibility of a story there. And then when I realized that he had died in January, the end of January 1970, this supposed Hitler character in Indonesia, it was only shortly after that Yuri Andropov of the KGB orders those bodies to be dug up in Germany and cremated. Wow. It was like there was a juxtaposition of timeline there that just made me think, what is going on with this story? So I went and visited the grave of this guy in Indonesia and was shocked to find out that there were no dates on the tombstone, whereas every other tombstone in that Muslim cemetery had date of birth, date of death. This guy's didn't have it. Didn't have any dates. It's like they didn't know who this guy was or when he was born or when he really died.
Yeah, and it's amazing, really, when you dig deep into it. And there's just so many stories out there, so many different claims. All right, we're going to take a break. A lot more to come. You're listening to Jason JV, Beyond Reality Radio. We'll be back after this.
I wish I found
some better sounds no one's ever heard. I wish I had a better voice that sang some better words. I wish I found some chords in an order that is new. I wish I didn't have to rhyme every time I sang. I was told when I get older all my fears would shrink, but now I'm insecure and I care what people think. My name's Blurry Face and I care what you think. My name's Blurry Face and I. Wish we could turn back time to the good old days when the come. I'm never able to identify where it's coming from. I'd make a candle out of it if I ever found it. Try to sell it, never sell out of it. I'd probably only sell one. Maybe to my brother, cause we have the same nose, same clothes, homegrown, a stone's throw from a creek we used to roam.
Welcome back to the show. It's Beyond Reality Radio. We're talking with Peter Lavinda tonight. He is a historian and an author, and he's got many books out. We're talking about the book called Ratline right now. And Peter, you have what, dozen or so, maybe 14 books? You've got a bunch of them, right?
Oh, yeah, a bunch of them on various subjects, but I like to think of them all as chapters of one big book that I'm still writing.
All right, so sadly, we're not going to have a whole lot of time, but we have a lot of story to get to yet as it relates to Hitler and what actually happened to him after World War II. You uncover evidence. You believe he was buried on an island, died in 1970. Trace the path for us where Hitler leaves Berlin and actually ends up on this island, if in fact that's what happened.
Well, to understand this, you have to understand something about how the Nazis managed their escapes. It was something called the Rat Line. And part of the Rat Line was the monastery route. That was the very first Rat Line. It was created by a Catholic priest, a Monsignor from Croatia at the end of the war. He was helping the Croatian government, which was pro-Nazi, to escape to South America. And then that system that he set up, he used for everybody else, including some very famous Nazis, right? So he was the guy that was arranging all of this. And what they would do is give people false identities, false papers, false passports, all that sort of thing. Well, in this particular case, what's fascinating is that the person who escaped to Indonesia with his wife escaped in the name of a medical officer, a doctor. Somebody who didn't really practice medicine but was more of a bureaucrat. He was the chief medical officer of the Salzburg area under the Third Reich, which meant he was responsible in many cases for the murder of people who were too sick to live, useless eaters, as the Nazis called them. So people who might have been infirm or had maybe they were mentally disabled, physically disabled in some way, and then this was the guy that would order those people to be exterminated. So this was a doctor. They didn't really know that much about him at the time, this particular doctor. But the authorities gradually came to understand that this guy was probably a war criminal, and they were going to start looking for him. Well, the doctor disappeared. Now, the story is that he fled to northern Italy, and then in North Italy, he laid low for a while. Then he got his papers and escaped. The man who replaced Heinrich Himmler as head of the SS, when Himmler was caught dealing with the Allies trying to save his skin, was a man called Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Kaltenbrunner was the head of the SS, after Himmler. He was caught. He was captured near Salzburg, near where all of this is taking place, and he had on him papers showing that he was a medical doctor. In fact, he was carrying a doctor's bag when he was apprehended. The papers that he had were real papers of a real German doctor. So I started to wonder if maybe this German doctor who went to Indonesia was not really a German doctor. He was somebody like Kaltenbrunner who was using the papers of a real doctor, in this case, a Dr. Georg Anton Puch. Now, this guy was believed to have escaped to northern Italy and for some reason lays low for a number of years. There's a possibility that this is the guy who went to Argentina, but didn't stay there very long, and then eventually made his way to Indonesia. And the reason I give for that is because I think that Hitler, at the end of the war, when his own generals tried to kill him in July of 1944, Operation Valkyrie, and when he realized that Himmler had turned against him, and that most of the high command was disobeying his orders, ignoring him, and cutting side deals with the Allies, why would Hitler then go to Argentina where all the other Nazis were turning up? And with the danger that somebody would drop a dime on him and hand him over to the authorities so that they would save their own skin. I think that Hitler would not feel safe with his fellow Nazis around since they all try to kill him or double deal on him. So I think that eventually, if I was Hitler and my closest friend in the bunker was a guy called Walter Havel, who had spent 10 years in Indonesia developing the Nazi party apparatus in Indonesia before the war, and had nothing but stories about Indonesia and about living in Java and living in the various islands, so much so they called him Surabaya Wali. And he's never been found. His body was never found. He was with Hitler until the very last. He was one of the last people to leave the bunker. So you put all this together, and suddenly you have the story that maybe Indonesia would have been a perfect place for Hitler to hide. It was a Muslim country. Mossad would not have shown up there, would have been really pretty obvious if they had. It was one of those places where he could have bought his way into obscurity. And I believe he did buy his way into obscurity because of evidence that came out later that both this mysterious German doctor, quote unquote, and his wife had bank accounts in Jakarta at a very obscure Indonesian bank, which later became the center of a controversy over something called the Revolutionary Fund, which was set up by Sukarno in Indonesia when he took over at the end of the war, and which was financed by Nazi gold shipped from Portugal. So the whole story fell together for me that there was something more going on in Indonesia, and that these people, this doctor and his wife, might be the key to it, and might be the key to what happened to Adolf Hitler.
It's a fascinating point because the I guess common belief for those who may be talking about Hitler escaping is the South American option. But the fact that most of those high-level Nazis either did plot against or turn against Hitler in the final days would make it logical that he would look to be somewhere else. But the question I would have is, Hitler was such a narcissist. It's almost difficult to believe that even in exile he would not be looking to make a return in some way. Do you think he was so completely defeated and knew that if he was discovered in any way that he was a dead man, that he was just satisfied to just live out his days in obscurity, in anonymity?
I get your point, and I see that exactly. And it's very possible that Hitler would have eventually felt that way. Initially, he would have been frightened for his skin. He would have laid low, but then he would have started plotting, right? He would have started plotting a comeback.
Right.
And actually, we have some evidence that he did that in Indonesia. During the year of living dangerously in 1965, when Sukarno was being overthrown, because Sukarno was believed to be in bed with the communists, particularly the Chinese communists, which was kind of a trumped-up story, but nevertheless, they overthrew Sukarno and the generals took over. When that happened, for some reason, this guy who pretended to be a doctor shows up on the island of Bali at the height of the massacres of Balinese people by the security forces there, who thought that all the Balinese were cooperating with the communists or whatever. And he actually went there. He was there in Bali at that time, and then returned to his island in Indonesia, telling his wife that he felt, great that he met some old comrades there, and everything was going swimmingly. There's this idea that maybe he might have been involved in the overthrow of Sukarno, either financially with Nazi gold or in some other way by lending some kind of leadership or control, and that he was getting back into his old way of running things, being the Führer, which is why I think by 1970 somebody had convinced him to leave his island and go to Java, to this big port city of Surabaya, which he never did. He hated leaving his little area there where he was kind of obscure and away from all foreigners and everything else. He went to Surabaya on a pretext that we don't quite understand, and within a day he was dead.
Wow.
So I'm wondering if perhaps that was engineered. Somebody convinced him to go there. When he got there, they took care of him, and now he's buried in a cemetery that I went to visit in Surabaya.
Is there any evidence that later, as years passed, from the point where he arrived on the island to the point where he may have been considering trying to make a comeback, that there was communication between him or anyone on the island and those exiled Nazis in South America?
Well, an interesting thing happened after Sukarno took over the government in the late 1940s, early 1950s. There was a visit to Indonesia by the man who had helped finance the Third Reich, the finance minister Hjalmar Schacht. Now, Hjalmar Schacht was the major finance minister. He was also considered a war criminal by the Allies. He got out after only a very short period of time, and he winds up in Indonesia. Again, Indonesia keeps coming up. And he's there as an advisor, quote unquote, to Sukarno as to what he should do to create a kind of a khalifa, a caliphate of all the Muslims in Southeast Asia to fight against the Chinese communists. So he was in Java at the same time that this doctor was in Indonesia, and conceivably also in Java the same year when he was setting up his bank accounts in Jakarta. So they crossed paths. Now, whether they met and discussed or they went through an intermediary, I'm not sure. But for Schacht to show up, who was Hitler's right hand, the guy who actually helped to finance the Third Reich, he shows up in Indonesia at the time when this Hitler person with this doctor also shows up in Indonesia. And there's a lot of gold and money involved in this transaction as well, and financing Sukarno and the so-called Revolutionary Fund, which was supposed to be set up to fight the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So there was all this stuff going on, all this politicking that's taking place. I don't know. I don't know the whole story. I'm still digging at that because the banking situation itself is tantalizing because it's an obscure bank. And yet Hitler and Braun, these two people, both had accounts at that bank in Jakarta. So something very fishy was going on there.
Well, so do you believe that there's more information that would say that Hitler went to Indonesia than Argentina then? Because I know a lot of the reports out there and a lot of the belief out there is that he made it to Argentina, and it's a big German colony out there as well in those areas. Do you think that there's more evidence to support Indonesia over Argentina?
I think in terms of the possibilities, I think there's just as much information. Let's put it this way, just as much evidence to suggest Indonesia. I used to think Argentina initially when I started covering the story. And then I looked at all the documents of the CIA, the FBI, and all the stuff that was going back and forth to Hoover about sightings of Hitler all over the place. And I thought to myself, there would have been better information than this. When I started looking at some of the other Nazi colonies in South America, in Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, and in Brazil, I thought to myself, we know where almost everybody was. We knew where Mengele was, for instance. We kept on missing him all the time. They picked up Eichmann in 1960, which would have scared the hell out of Hitler had he been in Argentina at the time, because they would have really gone after Hitler instead of Eichmann. But everybody else wound up there. Walter Rauff wound up there, Erich Priebke, Franz Stangl. All of these high-ranking Nazis wound up in Latin America and were kind of known. The Israelis even sort of held back from going after the rest of them for a lot of reasons, mostly geopolitical. If Hitler had been there, I think they would have found him. I just think that would have been their prime target. And I think that nobody really would have thought looking in Indonesia, of all places. That was just way off the radar, which I think it was the safest place, since there was a Nazi connection there and even a Nazi party apparatus where the Gestapo was going there telling the Japanese what Jews to arrest and put in the camps. I mean, it was that deep. And there was submarine traffic going from Germany to Indonesia. There was a lot of German submarine traffic back and forth. They were helping the Japanese, and the Japanese were supplying them with raw materials. So there was this constant intercourse back and forth between Europe and Indonesia during the entire period of the war. So it seemed to me that there was this whole Indonesian element of the story has been ignored until now. Nobody really paid attention to it, but the evidence is there. There's photographs, there's testimony, there's documents, there's everything. There was a large Nazi apparatus there.
Well, and if you think about it, him coming to Argentina, it would appear as if he was pretty much in our own backyard. It would be sort of a scary thing. Heading out to Indonesia sort of puts you out of the way of everything.
Absolutely.
Peter, we only have a couple minutes left, but one of the things I think we failed to do with this story is really accurately portray the timeline. How long did this man hide in Europe, and I think it was northern Italy that you said, before he made his escape from Europe to wherever and ending up in Indonesia? Well,
we know a handful of things. We know that the so-called doctor wound up in northern Italy in 1946. And then he left Europe for Indonesia in the late 1952 or 1953, early 1953. So there's this big chunk of time that's unaccounted for, which is the mysterious part of the story for me, because it doesn't make sense. The documents that we have, the records that this guy kept, shows that he had all the information about the rat lines that he needed. He had the name and address of that Catholic priest I mentioned. He had the names and addresses of safe houses throughout North Italy, all the way to Genoa. There was even evidence he was taking Spanish lessons. I mean, everything is there in this documentation that suggested this guy would have gone to Argentina. But then suddenly, we have other documentation showing that he left Rotterdam in the Netherlands on a ship bound for Jakarta. So there's this disconnect. There's a space of time between 46 and 53 where, unbelievably, he's still in northern Italy, which is why I tended to think that the doctor went to northern Italy and then the doctor was removed and replaced with Hitler when they found a suitable guy who looked like him, who spoke German with an Austrian accent, the way this guy would have. I mean, the right size, the right shape, even down to the mustache. This guy was sort of a dead ringer. So maybe there was that space of time was to develop this alternate personality.
One final question, and we're going to have to let you go. This is a quick one, though. Going back to the Russians and their discovery of these bodies, do you believe that the Russians were complicit in a cover-up here, or did they just bungle the whole thing?
I think they bungled it initially, but by 1970, Andropov knew there was something wrong with the bodies, which is why he had them destroyed. It doesn't make any sense otherwise.
And then just cover their tracks. So, Peter, Thanks so much for coming and hanging out with us, and it's always a pleasure talking to you, and we look forward to having you on again in the near future.
No worries, man.
Yeah, Peter, please promise to come back. And I want to remind everybody, this whole story, Peter's evidence and everything he's discovered and talked about here tonight is available in the book Ratline and the follow-up book, The Hitler Legacy. So check out all of that on Amazon and everywhere else that books are sold. Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, come back and wrap things up. You're listening to Jason and JV, Beyond Reality Radio. We'll be back after this.
barely scratched the surface on that discussion with Peter Lavinda about what actually happened to Hitler after the war. As you said, Jay, there's a lot of thought that he went to Argentina. Peter's contention is he went to Indonesia. And we only began the discussion. If you want to find out more about Peter's version of events, and he's got a lot of great information that supports his version, grab his book, Ratline. It's a fantastic book, and it really outlines that argument very, very well. But it's still a big mystery, and one that, boy, we should have some answers to.
Yeah, and I definitely feel like we got duped. Bottom line. So.
Well, I mean, I wasn't aware of how inept the Russians were at the end of the war when they found these bodies, and they took them and buried them and took them and buried them and took them and then buried them under a parking lot and paved over. I mean,
just none of it makes sense.
None of it makes sense. And these are bodies that are of significant historical importance. And I understand, like when we killed Osama bin Laden, we didn't want a grave. So he was ejected into the ocean. Remember, buried at sea, so that there couldn't be martyrs. Because we understood that. But yet, we handled it properly and we documented it properly. And I mean, that's the same thing here. There should have been some evidence kept so that people knew that this was actually Hitler, if in fact it was.
Absolutely. So, all right. And make sure you tune in tomorrow. We got some great shows coming up. You're listening to Jason and JV Beyond Reality Radio. We'll catch you all tomorrow night.
Okay, so first of all, Daisy wins the award for being the super special chat room listener tonight. You guys are awesome, and Daisy, you are awesomer tonight. That was delicious pizza, by the way. I probably shouldn't have eaten it. I had 3 pieces, and I wanted a 4th, but I know if I had the 4th, I would have been sitting here not able to talk at all, so I had to leave it at 3, but it was delicious. Thank you so much. And everybody else, I don't know what the poon thing is, but hey, I'm not even going to ask, okay? You guys, whatever, do your thing. I'm not even going to, as long as Doug's got control, like Doug has control, I'm good. So have a great night, everybody. And I will, it's right, Toey, pepperoni burps. It's not good. That's why I never eat before a gig. I can't, because I'll be trying to sing and I'm burping up whatever I ate. Yeah, it's not good and not pretty, and I shouldn't be talking about it. But either way, you guys are awesome. Thank you so much for hanging out. We had a great crowd tonight. It seems to be getting bigger, which is kind of cool. So have a great night, and we will see you tomorrow night. We've got a good one scheduled for tomorrow night. Take care.